The boy sat in the dust like something cast off and forgotten, his knees drawn up to his chest, arms wrapped tight around them. Wind combed the plains in long, low howls, lifting dirt into the air where it danced before dying. The sun was cruel overhead, not because it blazed, but because it didn't care. It burned with a steady indifference, spreading light over the rail platform, the tracks, the empty station, and him like a judgment. A paper tag flapped weakly from a frayed piece of twine tied around his neck. The name on it was smudged. You could still make it out if you looked close, but no one did. All that was clear were two block letters scrawled across the top: Unwanted. His coat was too big, the sleeves swallowed his hands. A straw hat lay beside him, bent in the middle like it had been stepped on. He didn't reach for it. Hadn't moved at all since the train pulled away, trailing a veil of black smoke behind it, carrying off the last people who might have spoken his name. Across the yard, cattle stirred behind a crooked fence, their lowing faint, almost uncertain. A wagon rattled past without slowing. Dust followed it, and the boy squinted against it, not because it bothered him, but because squinting made the world smaller. The station master had said someone was supposed to meet him. Someone with a ranch. A man who'd agreed to take one of the orphans off the church's hands. Feed him, put him to work. Try to make a man out of what was left. But the man was late. Or maybe not coming. Time passed slow as sap. The boy didn't cry. He just stayed there, still as a weed growing out of a rock. A dog came by and sniffed at him, then turned and trotted off toward town. Even it had someplace to be. The boy's stomach growled, but he ignored it. Hunger had long ago stopped being an emergency. It was just another ache like the one behind his eyes, the one in his chest. He didn't know how many days it had been since Sister Mary pushed him onto the train with a cracked loaf of bread and said, "You be good now, Eli. Make yourself useful." He'd tried to ask where he was going, but she was already walking away. There were 3 other children sent off with him, all headed to different places, all with paper tags like his. He wondered if they'd found homes yet. Eli shifted just enough to rest his cheek on his arm. The wood of the platform was warm, rough. The smell of old tar and splinters filled his nose. He thought of the orphanage's attic in summer, how the air got so hot it shimmered, how the nuns kept the windows shut to punish the ones who talked too much at night. He'd learned not to talk, learned it deep. A shadow fell over him, long and steady. Boots stood there, not polished ones like the priest wore. These were scuffed, worn down at the heels, toes dulled by dust and miles. A man stood in them, tall and rangy, with a face browned from years in the sun, and a hat pulled low. His voice came low and gravel rough. "You, Eli?" The boy didn't answer right away. He looked at the boots, the dust, then up at the man's belt, and finally his face. The man looked down at him without a smile. Just looked. Like he was trying to figure something out. Like maybe he'd seen a lot of boys sitting on a lot of platforms and most of them didn't look back. "Sign says you're unwanted," the man said quietly. "That true?" Eli blinked, thought about it. Then he gave the smallest shrug in the world. The man reached down, not fast, not slow, and picked up the tag, turned it over, squinted at the name underneath. "Ellie Boone," he said out loud. "A name's a thing worth something." He folded the tag and slipped it into his coat. Then he stuck out his hand. "Name's Silas Reed. I got a place northwest. Works hard, food's plain, and folks mind their own. You come, you pull your weight. Fair." Eli looked at the hand, at the lines and cracks and scars. Then slowly he pulled one arm from his sleeve and took it. Silas didn't smile, but he gave a nod, a quiet one, like the deal had been struck. They walked off together toward the waiting horse hitched outside the station. The sun still burned. The wind still moaned. But now there were 2 shapes moving across the dust. The road was nothing more than a strip of dirt carved through grassland bordered by barbed wire and the occasional crooked post. The wagon creaked beneath them with every rut it hit, and the mule pulling it moved like it had seen too many winters. Silas didn't talk much. He held the reins with loose fingers and watched the horizon like it might shift if he stared long enough. Eli sat on the bench beside him, coat sleeves pushed up now, hands clasped in his lap. He watched the land roll by flat and quiet, broken by scattered mesquite and a few cattle grazing like they'd forgotten what it meant to hurry. Somewhere out there a hawk circled. They didn't pass another person for what felt like hours. "You used to horses, Silas?" asked without looking at him. Eli shook his head. "You will be." The silence after that was longer than before, but it didn't feel sharp. More like a blanket stretched between them, thin but not cold. By the time they turned off the main road and crossed a shallow creek, the sun had started to sink. Orange bled into the sky, soft and slow, casting everything in a kind of golden hush. The ranch rose out of the ground like it belonged there. A modest house of weathered wood, a barn leaning slightly to one side, and a small corral that held 2 tired-looking mares and 1 lanky colt. Silas stopped the wagon and climbed down. "Come on," he said. Eli followed, stiff from the ride. His legs trembled a little when he hit the ground, but he didn't let it show. The ranch smelled of earth, hay, and something faintly sweet, maybe wildflowers somewhere nearby. A dog barked once from inside the barn, then quieted. Silas led him to the house, opened the door, and stepped aside. "Go on in." Boots off. The inside was plain wood floors, a cast-iron stove, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs. A coat hung on a nail by the door. A rifle rested in a corner. The air held the scent of beans and coffee long gone cold. Silas pointed toward a small room off the main space. "That's yours. Ain't much, but it's dry. You clean it, you keep it." Eli peeked inside. A narrow bed, a trunk, a tiny window. He nodded. Back in the kitchen, Silas poured water into a tin cup and handed it to him. Eli drank slow and steady, like he was afraid it might disappear if he moved too fast. "Food's not ready yet," Silas said. "I got stew going. You know how to chop wood?" Eli hesitated, then nodded again. He wasn't sure, but he'd seen it done. He could try. Silas motioned with his chin. "Out back. Axe by the post. Bring in 12 splits." The boy moved without speaking. The axe was heavy, the handle worn smooth. The woodpile was half-dead cedar and mesquite stacked unevenly beside the fence. Eli rolled up his sleeves and picked a log. He missed the first swing, caught the second, and started to find a rhythm. By the time he brought the armful inside, his hands stung and sweat trickled down his spine. Silas looked over from the stove. "Good enough." They ate in silence. The stew was thick with beans and a little salted pork. Eli ate like someone afraid to be told to stop. When he was done, he folded his hands in his lap and looked down. Silas refilled his cup. "Tomorrow we mend fence," he said. "You ride with me. We got coyotes tearing into the herd and the wire's been left too long." Ellie glanced up. "I don't know how to ride." Silas didn't smile, but something in his eyes softened. "You will." That night he lay in the bed staring at the ceiling. The mattress was thin, the blanket scratchy, but it was quiet. No creaking boards overhead, no coughing from the other boys, no hiss of steam from the old orphanage pipes. Just wind outside, brushing the side of the house like a whisper. He turned onto his side and curled up, eyes open. His hand slipped under the pillow where he'd tucked the folded paper tag. The one Silas had taken then left on the nightstand without saying a word. He touched it, fingers resting on the creases. The word Unwanted was still there. But so was his name. If this road mattered, subscribe and follow it. The next morning came with a hard light and the sound of chickens scratching near the porch. Eli woke before the sun crested fully, though he wasn't sure if he'd really slept. The bed still felt unfamiliar and the quiet was too thick. He dressed quickly, same clothes as yesterday, though he tried to smooth them best he could, and stepped outside. The air had a bite to it, cold but not cruel. Dew clung to the grass like silver threads, and in the east the sky was the pale color of tin before it rust. Silas was already at the barn brushing down one of the mares. He didn't say anything when Eli approached, just handed him the curry comb and pointed to the colt, who eyed Eli warily. "He's green, like you," Silas said. "Skittish. Needs someone quiet." Eli took the comb and moved slow, talking under his breath, the way he'd once seen a stable hand do in town. His hands were awkward at first, but he watched Silas, copied the movements, learned fast. They saddled up after that, Silas on the mare, Ellie riding behind, at first gripping the back of the saddle with stiff fingers. By the time the sun was up, Silas had eased him onto the colt and was leading him on a rope. It was clumsy and slow, but it was riding. They spent the morning mending fence, the kind of work that didn't let a boy's mind wander. Silas showed him how to stretch wire tight, how to drive a staple into a dry post, how to tell when a fence was good enough to hold. Eli listened, nodded, and worked without complaint. His hands blistered before noon. By midday they sat in the shade of a mesquite tree, eating cold cornbread and apples from Silas's coat pocket. Flies buzzed and the silence stretched. "You from Texas?" Silas asked, chewing. Eli shrugged. "Don't know." Silas wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Folks don't just pop out of the ground." Eli broke off a piece of cornbread and held it in his mouth. Chewed. Swallowed. "I was in St. Agnes' home since I was little. Don't remember much before that." "Any people?" "No." Silas nodded like that made sense. "Well, you got work here. Long as you do it honest." They rode the fence line in silence again. That was the thing about Silas, he didn't fill space with words. He expected a boy to pay attention, not chatter. Eli liked that. It gave him room to think without defending himself. The ranch turned golden in the late afternoon. Cattle moved slow and heavy across the pasture, their backs catching the last light. Eli helped shovel manure, hauled water, swept the barn aisle, until his arms ached. Every time he thought the day was over, there was something else to do. He didn't mind. That night Silas lit a fire in the stove and handed Eli a worn book with cracked leather edges. "Don't know how far your reading goes. This one's simple enough." Eli opened it carefully. "The Prairie Traveler," it said. Inside, maps and lists and strange words like carbines and scurvy. He read aloud in a whisper while Silas smoked his pipe in silence. "You read like you mean it," Silas said after a while. Eli glanced up. "Some folks read just to get through. You read like you want to know." Eli looked back down at the page. He didn't know what to say to that. Later, when the fire had burned low and Silas went to bed, Eli stood out on the porch. The night spread wide and deep. Stars crowded the sky more than he'd ever seen in the city. Crickets hummed low and an owl called from somewhere out near the ridge. He pressed the paper tag flat in his palm. It had torn slightly at one corner. He walked to the fire and watched the coals shift and breathe. For a long time he stood with the paper in his hand. Then he folded it once, then again, and tucked it back in his pocket. Not yet. He wasn't done with it. The days settled into a rhythm. Wake before light, work until dark. Eli learned how to mend tack, how to count cattle by the shift of dust and color in the field, how to patch a shirt with thick thread and careful fingers. He spoke little, but his silence wasn't empty. It held attention, calculation, a kind of quiet watchfulness. Silas didn't hover. He showed a thing once, maybe twice, then expected it done right. He didn't praise, didn't scold, but now and then he gave a short nod when Eli set a post straight or brought the colt back calm after a spook. That was enough. The boy's body changed first, arms growing ropey, legs steadier in the stirrups, a tan blooming along his neck and wrist. But it was the small changes Silas noticed more, the way Eli started tying his own knots without being asked, how he listened to the rhythm of hooves and rein with the same careful ear, the way he always finished what he started. One evening, late in the third week, Silas returned from town with flour, a coil of rope, and a surprise, a second tin cup, smaller and clean. "Figured you earned it," he said, setting it beside Eli's plate. "No more sharing." Eli turned it over in his hands like it was made of something rare. "Thank you," he said, just loud enough to be heard. That night he washed it carefully and set it on the shelf above his bed. Rain came a few days later, long and steady, turning the dry ground slick and soft. They worked through it anyway, blanketing the horses, moving tools inside, checking the creek near the edge of the property to make sure it wouldn't rise past the bridge. By evening, both of them were soaked through. Silas peeled off his coat at the door, steam rising off his shoulders. "You'll want to change," he told Eli. "Nothing worse than sleeping wet." Eli didn't answer. He stood near the stove, shivering. Silas glanced over, then reached into the trunk in the corner, pulled out an old wool shirt and tossed it his way. Too big but warm. Eli changed behind the barn door, came back smelling of rain and cedar. The sleeves swallowed his hands again, but he didn't seem to mind. Dinner was eggs, pan-fried potatoes, and coffee so bitter it made Eli blink. Silas offered him a spoonful of sugar from the little tin they kept hidden behind the salt. Eli took it like it was gold. Later, while drying their boots by the fire, Silas spoke without looking up. "Used to be 3 of us," he said. "Me, my brother, and our father built this place up after the war, bit at a time." Eli didn't speak, but his body went still. "Brother died of fever. Father, a year later, heart just quit. Been alone since." The words fell into the room like bricks. Not heavy, but not soft either. Silas didn't seem sad saying them. Just truthful. Eli nodded once. "I never had brothers," he said. Silas looked over. "You do now." They sat in silence after that, the kind that didn't need filling. In the weeks that followed, Eli began to hum while he worked. Soft, tuneless bits of melody that drifted on the air like smoke. Silas never mentioned it, but sometimes he whistled back off key but steady like an answer. The colt grew steadier too. Under Eli's hands he stopped jumping at shadows and started lowering his head for the halter. Silas watched from the fence one morning, arms crossed. "You're good with him," he said. Eli shrugged. "He just needed someone not to hit him." Silas's mouth tightened, not quite a frown, but close. "That's more than most folks know." The sky that night turned copper at the edges. They sat out on the porch watching the light fade behind the hills. Eli leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "What do you do when the past still feels like it owns you?" he asked quiet. Silas lit his pipe, took a drag, let the smoke drift. "You learn to stop renting its space." They didn't speak after that. Just watched the dark roll in side by side with the quiet kind of ease that doesn't need to be named. Summer deepened, thickening the air with heat and insects. By July the creek had shrunk to a thread, and every step outside raised a cloud of dust. Eli had grown leaner, tougher. The blisters on his hands were gone, replaced by calluses hard as horn. His face had filled out too, not with weight but with something steadier. A kind of presence. He stood straighter, spoke clearer. The ranch had settled into him, bone and breath. One afternoon, while patching a gap in the fence near the south pasture, they heard hoofbeats fast, wild. Silas rose to his feet, squinting into the shimmer of heat. A rider was coming down the trail, hat blown back, shirt flapping. "Trouble," Silas muttered. The horse slid to a stop near the fence, sweat lathered across its flanks. The man in the saddle was young, dust-covered and breathing hard. "Silas," he said, "they're coming for the land." Silas's jaw clenched. "Who?" "The Claytons. Say you never paid full for the water rights. Claim they've got papers some cousin of theirs found 'em in the courthouse up in Taylor." "That land's mine," Silas said, voice flat. "Bought and worked. Every foot of it." The rider shook his head. "Doesn't matter. They're comin' with a man from the county and a letter from the judge." Silas nodded once. "I'll be there." The rider turned and left hoofbeats pounding down the trail. Eli stood still, post-hole digger in hand. "What's going to happen?" Silas pulled off his gloves. "Depends on who tells the better story, and who's willing to stand their ground." He didn't say more, just turned and walked back toward the barn. Eli followed silent. That evening, Silas shaved, combed his hair, and pulled on the coat he kept wrapped in oilcloth in the trunk. He looked like a man headed to war, not court. At the door he paused and looked at Eli. "You stay here tomorrow. Run the place like I would. Don't let it go still." Eli nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, sir." Silas's eyes softened. "This place matters, Eli. Not just the land, the work. The way it's run. Honest. Steady. It tells the truth even when people don't." He left before dawn the next morning. The sound of his horse faded slow over the hills. Eli worked that day like he'd been born to it. Mended wire, watered the horses, swept the barn twice, fed the chickens, and walked the fence line alone. He didn't talk to himself, didn't hum, just kept moving. When the sun set and Silas still wasn't back, Eli sat on the porch with the dog at his feet and watched the road. Hours passed. Then hoofbeats. Silas returned under a bruised sky dust on his boots, jaw set tight. Eli stood as he dismounted. "Well?" he asked. Silas handed him a folded paper. They backed off. Judge didn't believe the cousin. Called it a bad copy. Said anyone who works a ranch like ours earns their name on the deed. Eli unfolded the page slowly. It was stamped, signed. Silas nodded at it. "That's as good as blood around here." Eli held it like something sacred. Later over supper, Silas said, "You stood up today. Ran the place like it mattered. That's not small." Eli poked at his beans. "I didn't want it to be quiet again. Not like before." Silas looked at him a long time. "It won't be?" That night after the lamps were out and the stars rose, Eli sat at the edge of his bed and unfolded the paper tag from his pocket. The creases were worn through now, the ink faint, but the word was still there, Unwanted. He held it over the flame of the lantern, watched it curl and blacken, watched it vanish. He didn't need it anymore. By late August, the land had turned brittle and brown. The heat came in waves, rising off the ground in shimmering veils. Work slowed under the weight of it, but it didn't stop. Eli rose earlier, moving through the morning chores with the quiet efficiency of someone who no longer needed to be told what came next. He and Silas worked side by side, fixing gates, tending sick calves, cutting back brush from the fence line. There was no talk of school, no tutors or lessons, but Eli was learning more than any book had ever taught him. He could spot illness in a cow by the tilt of its head. He knew which clouds meant real rain and which were just bluff. He learned how to barter in town without being cheated and when to keep his eyes down in a saloon. But the biggest change came not in him but in Silas. He began to talk more. Not about himself, not directly, but about the land, the past. Small stories that slipped out in the evenings like seeds dropped without care to where they might take root. "That hill over yonder," he said, once pointing past the barn, "that's where my father's buried. Dug the grave myself. Rain came halfway through and filled it with mud. Took me half the night to finish. Another time used to be a neighbor up north, Mrs. Colvin. Tough as nails. Lost her husband in the first freeze and raised 6 kids anyway. Taught me how to make soap and kill a rattler clean. Eli listened like a well-listened, silent but deep. One night as they sat on the porch chewing dried apples and watching heat lightning dance across the horizon, Silas spoke in a voice different than usual. Lower. Almost like it wasn't meant for the boy at all. I never meant to be alone this long. Eli didn't say anything. Silas glanced at him, then looked back to the sky. I used to think it was safer. No one to disappoint. No one to bury. Eli's voice came quiet. And now, Silas shrugged. Now I know quiet can break a man worse than grief. The next morning a letter arrived by stage. Not from the county, from a woman. Silas opened it slow, read it twice, then left it on the table without a word. Eli read it only because Silas didn't hide it. The name at the bottom meant nothing to him, but the writing was careful, gentle. She asked if Silas had changed his mind. Said she'd still come if he said the word. He didn't reply to it. Not right away. But he stopped by the post office a few days later and Eli noticed the letter was gone. The shift came in strange ways after that. Silas brought back a second rocking chair from town, repainted the porch steps, started making more food than 2 people needed. And then one day, a wagon arrived. Eli heard it before he saw it, iron wheels grinding the dry road, a team of bays pulling slow under the sun. A woman sat on the bench seat, hands folded in her lap, hat pulled low. Behind her, a young girl clutched a rag doll, her eyes wide with wonder. Silas stepped off the porch, but didn't run to meet them. He waited. She climbed down first, steady as anything, and looked around. Looks the same, she said. Silas nodded, still standing. They stood that way a moment. Then the girl stepped down, looked up at Eli, and offered a half smile. Eli blinked. He didn't know what this was, who they were, or what it meant. But he didn't feel afraid. Silas turned to him. This is Nora, he said, and her daughter June. The woman smiled, warm but cautious. Hello, Eli. Heard a lot about you. He didn't know what to say. He looked at Silas, then at June, then back to the woman. Ma'am, he managed. That night there were 3 plates on the table. Laughter too soft at first, like it didn't trust the room yet. June chattered about a goat she'd once had. Silas listened, smiling more than Eli had ever seen. Nora asked about the ranch, about Eli's colt, about the spring up past the ridge. Later, after the dishes were done and the girl had gone to bed, Silas and Nora sat on the porch. Eli stayed by the door, half listening, not quite part of it, but not outside either. I didn't know if you'd write back, she said. Took me time to believe I could. She touched his hand. This place, this life, it doesn't scare me. Silas looked out at the fields. It used to scare me being known, having something to lose. You already do, she said gently. Eli stood there still and quiet. And for the first time the thought crept in, not fear, not doubt, but something else. Belonging. Fall rolled in quiet on a wind that smelled of dust and apples. The days shortened and the light turned gold around the edges, softer than the hard glare of summer. The land changed too. Grass turned brittle. The cattle moved slower. Shadows stretched long across the fields by afternoon, like the earth itself was tired. Inside the house, everything was different. Nora moved through the rooms with quiet purpose, humming, while she stirred beans, stacking quilts in the trunk near the hearth, sweeping without needing to be asked. She didn't try to fill the silence, but somehow it felt fuller with her in it. The house that had once echoed now breathed. June followed Eli around like a calf after its mother, too shy to talk much at first, but always close behind. She trailed him to the barn, to the corral, even to the creek. At first he didn't know what to do with her, but when she asked if horses could understand sadness, he looked at her different. "They know more than folks think," he said. From then on, she rode the colt with him, bareback, holding tight, laughing when they trotted through the dry grass and spooked up doves. Her laughter reminded Eli of water, rare and clear. One evening, Nora found him in the barn cleaning tack by lamplight. She watched a long moment, then stepped forward with a tin of salve. "You ever get those hands looked at?" she asked. He shrugged. "They're just hands." She took one gently, rubbed the salve into his knuckles. Her fingers were small but strong. "You've been doing a man's work," she said. He looked down. "I'm just trying to be worth the room I take up." She met his eyes. "You already are." That night he lay awake under the same blanket, but the weight on his chest was different. It wasn't fear anymore. It was something else. Something heavier but kinder. A week later, news came from town. The Claytons were stirring again, this time not about land but names. Word had spread that Silas had taken in a boy and now a woman and her child. That he was giving away his legacy, letting people in who had no blood claim to the place. It was a Sunday when they showed up, two brothers on horseback, one older, one thin and mean-eyed. They didn't knock, just rode straight to the porch. Silas stepped out first. Eli came right after, Boots' dusty jaw tight. Nora watched from the doorway, one hand behind June. "You're building something that ain't yours to give away," the older brother said, spitting into the dust. Silas didn't flinch. "And who gets to decide what's worth keeping? A man with a name carved in a headstone, or one who shows up every day and earns it?" "You planning to leave it to him?" the thin one sneered, jerking his head toward Eli. "A charity case, a bastard with no kind." Eli didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there straight and still. Silas stepped forward, slow. "You say another word like that in front of my family and you won't ride home upright." The threat hung in the air, quiet and heavy. The Claytons exchanged a look. The older one gave a bitter smile. "We'll see how long that lasts." They turned and rode off, dust trailing behind them like smoke. That night Silas poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Eli. "You stood your ground," he said. "I didn't do anything," Eli replied. "You didn't run. That's more than most." He paused. Then, like he hadn't planned to say it out loud, "I'm writing you into the deed." Eli's heart thudded. He stared at the mug in his hands. "You don't have to," he said. "I know. That's why I am." The next morning, Eli saddled the colt before sunrise. June came out in her nightdress, rubbing her eyes. "Where are you going?" she asked. He looked down at her. "Just riding." "Thinking." "Don't go far," she whispered. "It's different when you're not here." Eli nodded. "It's different for me, too." He rode out toward the ridge where the land rose just enough to see for miles. The wind met him there, cool and dry, tugging at his sleeves. He pulled the reins and looked back. The house stood small but strong in the distance, the smoke from the chimney curling upward like a thread holding everything together. His home, his name, his choice. Winter came quiet, not with a storm but with stillness. The wind dropped. The trees along the creek went bare, their bones stark against the gray sky. Frost spread thin and white across the porch railings in the mornings, and the breath of horses came out in clouds. Inside the house, warmth gathered where it could. The stove stayed lit. Quilts hung heavier on the beds. Nora kept a pot of stew going most days, and the smell of onions and broth filled the rooms like comfort. Eli split wood every morning before light. His swings were sharp, clean. He no longer looked like a boy playing at work. He was the work. Steady, reliable. He hardly noticed the cold unless June pressed her little hands to his and said, "Your fingers feel like river stones." Silas watched him from time to time, quiet pride under his usual quiet. "You've outgrown those boots," he said one day. Eli looked down. The leather had cracked at the sides. His toes curled against the edges. "I'll make do," he said. Silas grunted. "You don't need to." The next week a new pair appeared by the door. Worn but solid. Too big by half a size, which meant Silas had asked the cobbler to leave room. Eli didn't say thank you out loud. He just wore them like they belonged to him. Christmas came in its own way, no tree, no gifts, but Nora baked a sweetbread and Silas found a tin soldier for June at the general store. She held it like treasure and named it Eli, which made her blush and made Eli pretend not to hear. That night, after June was asleep and Nora was clearing dishes, Silas took a folded paper from his coat, held it out. Eli took it slowly, opened it. His name was there. Eli Boone, inked into the deed just below Silas Reed's. Legal. Final. "I had them stamp it in town," Silas said. "No one can argue now." Ellie stared at the page. "But I'm not your—" "You're my son," Silas said, firm. The words hit harder than any blow Ellie had ever taken. He couldn't speak, could barely breathe. "I never asked for," he began. "I know," Silas said. "Neither did I. But that's the thing about family. It ain't earned by blood. It's built by choice." Nora stood at the table, eyes wet. She didn't speak, just came over and touched Eli's shoulder. "You're not just part of this place," she said. "You are this place." The lamp crackled. Somewhere outside the horses shifted in the corral. Eli folded the paper carefully. His hands trembled. "Thank you," he whispered. "No," Silas said, voice low. "Thank you." Later that night, Eli walked out to the barn. The sky was wide and clear, stars strewn like salt across black velvet. He leaned against the rail, breathing in the cold, the hay, the quiet. June's doll lay forgotten on the porch step, left during her afternoon play. He picked it up and dusted it off, set it by the door so she'd find it in the morning. The wind brushed his face. He thought of that tag, long gone now. Burned. Gone to ash. The one that once said "Unwanted." And then he thought of this place. Of boots left by the door, of names written down for good, of someone calling you son because they chose to. He didn't smile. He breathed. Long. Slow. Full. The house behind him glowed warm through the window. A lamp still burned. Ellie turned toward it and went home. Subscribe and keep pace with the frontier.